Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are out there in Storyland. Hi, my name is Baden Prince, and this is a broadcast as part of the World Storytelling Cafe project put together by my friend and mentor, or should that be tormentor, Mr. John Rowe. And I'm going to be telling you some stories today. And the first story I'm going to start with I think is a story to cheer us all up in this time of doom, gloom, and despair. There's nothing you need in these kinds of times like a story about death. That's right. Nothing cheers you up when you're miserable like a story about death. And this is a story about, actually, it's not a story about death, it's a story about a man called John. Not that John, obviously, as you'll see from the story. It's a story about a man called John who lives in a town, a small town. Actually, it's not a small town, it's quite a large town. In fact, it's Colchester. So it's in fact a city. It's got a cathedral, it's got a football team, it's got a high street and everything. And in Colchester, this man, John, hears a rumor that death is coming to town. Now, illogically, he decides that death is coming to town to look for him. Because the rumor is death is coming to town to look for a man called John. Now, there's hundreds of people in this city called John. In fact, thousands of people called John. Probably hundreds of thousands of Johns in the city of Colchester. But he decides that it's him that death is coming to look for. Now, a couple of years ago, if I'd told this story about somebody behaving that irrationally, you'd have probably all laughed at me. But as we discovered a couple of years ago, and as we're seeing right about now, you cannot underestimate the capacity of human beings to act irrationally. Now, can you? We've got plenty of evidence, don't we? And I'm not even going to mention the B word. I'm not even going to mention the C word. In fact, I'm just going to leave you to ponder on that for a minute and you'll recognize the truth of what I'm saying. So John decides death is coming for him and he's not going to stick around and wait for it. Oh, no. So illogically, he packs his bags and leaves town. And he heads off for the smallest and most obscure place that he can think of. Braintree in Essex. A place where I'm reliably informed there's neither a tree nor a brain to be found anywhere. I couldn't possibly comment. Anyway, off he goes to Braintree. And he roams around the back streets and the back alleys, and eventually he comes across an obscure little boarding house above a cafe, and he thinks, perfect. It's so tucked away, so hidden away, so obscure, death will never find me here. So he goes in and he speaks to the landlady, and she says, right, so what's your name? And he says, oh, my name's Paul. He thinks, haha, just to be on the safe side, I'll change my name to Paul as well. Thinks he's foxed him. Goes up, unpacks his bags, and then goes downstairs into the cafe to have some supper. He's ordered, he's got his meal, he's sat down, and he's just about to tuck in. Who walks in through the door, do you think? That's right, death. You know, black cloak, sickle. Comes up and sits at the table right next to him. So John, or rather Paul, as he's now called, turns to Death and says, hey, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be in Colchester? Death turns to him and says, yeah, but I had to make one stop on the way in this place. Looking for a fella named Paul. I hear he might have just moved into the area. The moral of the story is you can't cheat fate, no matter how hard you try. Continuing my set for the World Storytelling Cafe, Baden Prince Jr. here. And I'm going to tell you a Nasruddin story. I stumbled across these, quite a few years ago. I was introduced to them by a member of a book club up in Havering, where I was writer in residence briefly in 2003-04 and again in 2007-08. And this member of the book club was a big fan of the Nasruddin stories, and so am I, and have been ever since I was first introduced to them. And I'm going to tell you a couple, but I'm going to tell you one, then move on, and then I'll come back and tell you a second. And this one I read recently. Nasruddin was speaking to a very pompous, very self-righteous and self-important ruler who pointed out to Nasruddin that many of the great rulers in the past had given themselves names that were linked somehow to their divine right to rule. So the names translated meant the heaven sent, whatever, or the heaven blessed, whatever, or the heaven appointed, whatever. And this pompous man said to Nasruddin, I think I should have one of those names, don't you? What do you think would be a suitable name for me? To which Nasruddin replied, heaven forbid. Oh, I love it. Okay. This next story that I'm going to tell is a slightly longer one. It goes by different names. I'm indebted to this particular version. I'm indebted for this particular version to Chip Colquhoun, whom I had the pleasure of sharing a storytelling tent with at Glastonbury last year. A lovely guy. And it's his version of a story called The Man Who Bored People to Death. I've done some work with it with younger children since. And so I've slightly, well, it's Chip's version of that story. And I've linked it to a sort of nice little story that I like to use, which I'm going to use to introduce it. I'm rambling a bit, aren't I? I do that. So this is The Never-Ending Story, introduced by a story called The Never-Ending Story, which goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a mountain. Inside the mountain, there was a cave. Inside the cave, there was a monk. The monk told a story. What was that story? Well, the story is that once upon a time, there was a mountain. And that inside the mountain, there was a cave. And that inside the cave, there was a monk who told a story. What was that story? The story is that once upon a time, there was a mountain. And that inside the mountain, there was a cave. Inside the cave, there was a monk who told a story. And this story is about the man who bored people to death. There was once a storyteller, and he was famous for his endless stories, which were all about himself. No matter what story he started to tell, it somehow ended up being about him. And his stories were so boring, they were the stuff of legend. It was said that he could bore someone to death. And that is exactly what happened one day. He was telling a story to a poor, unfortunate chap by the name of Patrick Rooney. His name was Andrew Coffey. And Patrick Rooney was sitting at a table when Andrew Coffey came and sat opposite him. And poor Patrick Rooney was busy having his supper. He was having a massive bowl of soup. And Andrew Coffey started telling this endless tale that went on and 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 on until poor Patrick Rooney fell fast asleep, face downwards in his bowl of soup. And Andrew Coffey, being the egomaniac that he was, didn't even notice. He just carried on talking regardless. And poor Patrick Rooney drowned. And so the prediction came true. Andrew Coffey had actually bored someone to death. Well, one night he was leaving the pub and making his way home as usual, and for some strange reason he found himself on this unfamiliar road. That's funny, he thought. He'd walked this route many, many times. Maybe he'd had a couple too many and was a little bit the worse for wear. But he set off along this unfamiliar road, which was long and straight and wide. And it was a bright moonlit night, so he could see for miles, miles ahead. And this was a completely featureless landscape. He'd never been in this part of the countryside before. Nothing to the left of him, nothing to the right. Straight ahead, just open, empty road. He walked, and he walked, and he walked, and he walked. And then suddenly, he became aware of footsteps behind him. Step, 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 step. He stopped. He turned and looked around. Couldn't see anything. Wide open road, bright moonlit night. He could see for miles in every direction. It was like being in Holland. Nothing, he thought. Oh, that's funny. It's probably just the echo of my own footsteps. And so he carried on walking. And as he started walking, so did the sound of the footsteps begin again behind him. Step, 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 step. Now, he was getting a little bit nervous, but he didn't want to admit to himself that he was getting nervous. So he speeded up a little bit. And as he speeded up, so did the sound of the footsteps. Step, 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 step. He stopped again. He turned again, looked behind him. Nothing. Turned and started walking, and as he started walking, the sound of the footsteps started up behind him. And this time, without trying to make it obvious that he was now quite frightened, he began walking very, very briskly. And as quickly as he walked, so did the sound of the footsteps behind him speed up. Step, 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 step. Finally, he just abandoned all pretense and started running at full speed down the road, with the sound of the footsteps pursuing him and seeming as if they were coming ever closer. And just as he began to really panic, he saw in the distance a silver birch tree. And the silver birch tree is so named because of its strange bark, which has a slight sheen to it. And on a moonlight night like this one, the rays of the moonlight bouncing off it made it actually gleam as if it were made of solid silver. He ran as fast as he could and hid behind the trunk of the tree, looked back down the road whence he'd came to see what it was that was pursuing him. But there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. And remember, he could see for miles, all the way back the way he'd come. To the left, to the right. Nothing, no one. He was all alone on this deserted road. And he said to himself, Andrew Coffey, you're being foolish. Come on, there's nothing here. And he turned and he carried on walking along the empty, featureless road. And no sooner had he set off than the sound of the footsteps started up behind him again. He thought, oh no. He speeded up a little bit. Step, step, step. step, 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 a little faster, step, 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 and then abandoning all pretense, he started running full speed, and again along this open, featureless road where there was nothing, suddenly, out of nowhere as it were, appeared a tree. The same tree, the same silver birch tree that he'd already passed once. He raced up to it, hid behind the trunk now for the second time, looked back down the road where he could see nothing. Nothing to the left, nothing to the right. Slightly worried, but now puzzled and mystified, he turned and started walking again. And as soon as he set off, so did the sound of the footsteps start up behind him. Step, 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 step. He speeded up. The footsteps speeded up. Step, 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 step. He went even faster. The footsteps went faster. Step, 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 step. He started running again at full tilt down the open, featureless road, and in front of him appeared the same silver birch tree that he'd already passed once. He'd already passed twice. He was now passing it for the third time. He raced up to it, hid behind it, looked back down the empty, featureless road where there was nothing. Nothing to the left, nothing to the right. By now he thought, Andrew Coffey, you're going mad. There's nothing here. It's just you. Come on, get a grip. And he turned, started walking, and as he started walking, the sound of the footsteps started up behind him. Step, 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 step. He started walking faster. Step, 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 and faster. Step, 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 step. And then he started running, and this time pelting down the road, full tilt. Over to his left, he saw the lights of a small cottage. Thank God for that, he thought, and he went off the road through the field at full speed up to the open door. He was about to bang on it as hard as he could, but the door was open. He ran in, slamming the door shut behind him. Paused for breath. Hello, he said. Is there anyone home? No answer, came the reply. He walked into the small cottage. No one was there. Whoever had been at home must have obviously just popped out for a minute, because there in the dining room, a table was set for one, with a bowl of stew, steam rising from it, a loaf of freshly cut bread and some butter, and an unopened bottle of wine. He sat down and waited for the resident to come back. He waited 10 minutes, 15 minutes, nobody. The smell of the stew began to get to him, because he realized he was actually quite hungry. And he looked at, it was a massive bowl of stew, more than enough for 2 people. He thought, I'm sure the head of the household won't object if I help myself to a little bit. And he picked up the spoon and he picked up a slice of bread, and he had a mouthful or two, and he had a bite of bread and then another couple of mouthfuls and another bite of bread, and then he picked up the second slice and another couple of mouthfuls, and before he knew what was what, he'd eaten off the entire bowl of stew and almost the whole loaf of bread. After a good meal, what do you want? Well, there was a bottle of wine sitting there begging to be opened, and he thought, oh, I'll just help myself to a glass of wine. So he opened the bottle of wine and he had a sip, and he thought, not bad. Not bad at all. Lovely. And he had another sip and another, and then another glass, and before he knew it, he drank the entire bottle. And then he sat down. And you know what happens after you've had a good meal and a good few glasses of wine? That's right. He fell fast asleep. He didn't know how long he'd been asleep, but Something brought him out of that sleep. As if he was being watched, he felt. Opened his eyes, and there, sitting across the table in front of him, was none other than the ghost of Patrick Rooney, the man he'd bored to death not long before. He jumped up with a start, but he was as if paralyzed, stuck to the chair. He couldn't actually lift himself out of it or think about moving or running. The ghost of Patrick Rooney leaned forward, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Andrew Coffey, tell me a story." Absolutely petrified, Andrew Coffey started telling the only story he could think about telling, and of course it had to be about himself. So the story he told was of the story about leaving the pub and heading off homewards and suddenly finding himself on a strange, empty, long, open road. In the moonlight he could see straight ahead and to the right and to the left, a completely featureless landscape, and as he walked he told of how he heard the footsteps behind him. Step, 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 step. He told about how he turned and saw nothing behind him and turned and carried on walking, and as he carried on walking the footsteps started up and they got louder and closer. Step, 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 and he started walking faster. Step, 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 and the footsteps started coming faster. Step, 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 and he started running, and he ran and he ran and he ran up to a silver birch tree that appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the road, and how he hid behind the tree and looked back down the road and saw nothing, and looked to the left, saw nothing, looked to the right, saw nothing, and turned and tried to tell himself that he was imagining the whole thing, and started walking again. And as he started walking, how the footsteps started up behind him again. Step, 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 and how he speeded up a little bit, and as he speeded up his gait, the footsteps speeded up behind him. Step, 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 and the faster he walked, the faster the footsteps kept up with him, and then he started running, and he ran and he ran and he ran until he saw in front of him yet again the same silver birch tree he'd already passed once, and he now ran and hid behind it for a second time, and looking down the road, saw nothing. Nothing in front of him, nothing to the left of him, nothing to the right of him. He turned and started walking again, and as he started walking, he heard the footsteps again. Step, 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 speeding up as he sped up. Step, 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 and how he walked as fast as he could, and then he broke into a run, and he sprinted down the road and ran to where the silver birch tree appeared in front of him for the third time, and how he hid behind it, and still looking back down the road, saw nothing, and looked to the left and looked to the right and saw nothing, and turned and started walking again, and the footsteps started again, and he ran and eventually saw the lights of the cottage, and he ran into the cottage and slammed the door shut and sat down, and how he'd waited and waited, and then he got hungry and he ate a little bit of the food, and then he ate a bit more, and he ate some of the bread and some more of the bread, and then he finished all the food and most of the bread, and then he poured himself a glass of wine, and he poured himself another, and eventually he drank the whole of the bottle of wine, and then sat down and fell asleep, and then he'd woken up and found himself sitting opposite the ghost of Patrick Rooney, who had told him to tell him a story. And when he'd finished telling the story, the ghost of Patrick Rooney leaned forward, looked him dead in the eye and said, "Andrew Coffey, tell me the story again." And petrified as he was, as frightened for his life as he was, he had no choice but to tell the story over again from the very beginning about how he left the pub, found himself on the open road, and he was walking along, the footsteps coming along behind him, step, 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 and then he'd run and hidden behind a silver birch tree once, looked down the road, looked to the left, looked to the right, saw nothing, turned, started walking again, and as he started walking, the footsteps started up behind him again, step, 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 and then the footsteps got faster as he walked faster, and then the footsteps got even faster as he walked even faster, and and then he started running, and the footsteps were running behind him, and he ran and ran and ran and ran up to the same silver birch tree he'd already passed once, and he now ran up to it for a second time and hid behind it for a second time, looked back down the road, and he saw nothing. Nothing in front of him, nothing to the left of him, nothing to the right of him. And he tried to tell himself he was imagining it all. And he turned and he started walking again. As he started walking, the footsteps started behind him again. And then he started walking faster, and the footsteps walked faster. And he started walking even faster, and the footsteps got even faster. And then he started running at full speed down the road, full tilt, until he ran up to the same silver birch tree he'd already passed once. He'd already passed twice. And he went and hid behind it for a third time, looked down the road, saw nothing, looked to the left, looked to the right, saw nothing, and he started walking again, and the footsteps started up again, and this time he ran, and then he looked over to the left, and he saw lights in the distance. He ran across the field and ran into the house, and how he'd run in and slammed the door behind him and sat down, and then the smell of the food got to him, and he had a little bit. Well, he only meant to have a little bit, but he had a little bit, then he had a little bit more, and he had a bit of the bread, and then a bit more of the bread, and he'd ended up eating off all of the stew and all of the bread, and then he'd had a glass of wine, only intending to have a little bit, and he'd had another glass, and he'd finished the wine and then sat down and fallen asleep, and then he'd woken up, and when he woke up, there in front of him was the ghost of Patrick Rooney, who told him to tell him a story, and how he told him the story, and the ghost had told him to tell him the story again. And when he'd finished telling the story for the second time, the ghost of Patrick Rooney leaned forward, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "Andrew Coffey, tell me the story again!" And this time, in spite of his fear, in spite of the fact that he felt rooted to the ground, stuck to the chair, somehow, with a superhuman effort, he leapt up and he ran out of the door. And he went racing back down that open road, past the same silver birch tree. And he didn't stop to check if there were footsteps behind him. He just ran and ran and ran. And then he ran until he passed the silver birch tree again for the second time. And he just kept running and running as fast as he could. He passed the silver birch tree for the third time. And then he ran across an open path and found himself facing the lights of the pub. And he raced in, burst through the door, threw himself down in a chair in the corner, out of breath, panting, heart pounding in his chest as if he was about to die. All the customers came and they gathered around him and they said, "Andrew Coffey, what's the matter with you? You look as if you've seen a ghost. Somebody quick." And somebody went and they fetched him a snifter of brandy, and somebody brought him a pint of ale, and somebody else brought a big fan, and they fanned him, and they opened a window, and somebody said, "Put the log on the fire. God, look at the state of him." And he drank the brandy and he drank the ale, and it revived him. And they all waited till he's got his breath back, and the care and the concern that they showed him was something he'd never experienced in his life. For the first time, he knew what it felt like to actually enjoy the company of others. And rather than talk to them just about himself, and rather than talk to them and tell them endless boring stories just about himself, he was experiencing companionship. He was experiencing friendship and concern. This was totally new to him. He was reveling in it. He felt like a new man. He felt like he'd been born again. He felt like this was a new beginning to his life. And he felt that from that day on, his world was never going to be the same. That is, until one of the assembled punters said to him, "So Andrew, tell us, when you came running in here, you were as white as a sheet. All the blood had drained out of you. You looked like a living dead. You looked as if you'd seen a ghost. What the hell happened?" He couldn't help himself, could he? He just couldn't help himself. So he started to tell them about how he left the pub, how he'd started walking along the road, found himself on this strange, long, wide, open road. Under the moonlight, he could see to the left, to the right. There was nothing. And how as he walked, he heard these footsteps start up behind him. Step, 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 step. Well, I'm going to tell you my second Nasruddin story. It's another short one. And it's the story of the time when Nasruddin was invited to give a talk to an audience. He walked into the auditorium and found that the audience was not as enthusiastic as he was somehow expecting. And he was a bit annoyed by this. I think it's fair to say he was pretty miffed. So he tried to find out what was wrong and asked the audience, excuse me, he said, you don't seem to be very interested in what I'm about to say. Is it that you already know what I'm going to tell you? The audience replied as one, no, we don't. Well, he said, I've got no interest in talking to people who don't know what I'm talking about. And he left. Well, the people who'd organized the gathering were a bit embarrassed. So they got in touch with him and they begged him to come back. And they said, this time, don't worry, the audience will be a lot more receptive. So reluctantly, Nasruddin came back. He was still a bit annoyed from the first visit. He got up on the podium and the audience was they'd been instructed to sit upright and look interested. And so he said, to test them, right, do you all know what I'm going to talk to you about? And they all looked at one another and thought, well, we'd better not give the answer we gave last time. So they all went, yes, of course we do. Yes, we do. In that case, said Nasruddin, there's no point me talking to you because you already know what I'm going to say. And he left. Well, the organizers were now really embarrassed. But they realized that he'd only done what he'd done because he was annoyed at what had happened the first time. So they got the audience back together and said, look, for God's sake, don't antagonize him. Just, whatever he asks you, just be nice. We want him to give this speech. So Nasruddin came back. They begged him and offered him twice the amount of money they'd already paid him. So he came back and he walked up on the podium and he looked out at the audience and he said, right, I'm going to ask you again. Do you know what I'm going to talk to you about today? And the audience looked at one another and half of them said, yes, we do. And the other half said, no, we don't, because now they didn't know what to say to him. Very good, said Nasruddin. Those of you who know what I'm going to say, tell those who don't know what I'm going to say. And with that, he left. I love that little story. So the next story that I'm going to do for you is, I'm at a bit of a loss here actually. In fact, I'm going to tell you, instead of the one that I was going to do, my favorite Nasruddin story. And then I'm going to do the next story to finish off with. So my favorite Nasruddin story is the one about, no, there are two. This is the problem. I've got two Nasruddin stories that I really love. So I'm going to tell you, I think, what mood am I in? I'm going to tell you the one about the flowers, because we've got the early signs of spring outside, the sun's shining, the trees are in blossom, and yeah, flowers seems like a good thing to go with. So Nasruddin, his fame had spread far and wide, all the way across the country. It had got to the point where poor Nasruddin couldn't get any sleep. Every minute of every day, people were beating a path to his door. Nasruddin, this. Nasruddin, that. Nasruddin, help me with it. Nasruddin, one man came to him. Nasruddin, he says, my business is, with all of this going on, all of this, first this Brexit thing and now this coronavirus. I mean, my business is going to pot. What can I do? Nasruddin thinks to himself, I don't know the first thing about business. I don't buy, I don't sell. But out loud, he says to the merchant, take your troubles to the Lord in prayer, and he will tell you what to do. Oh, Nasruddin, says the man, you are so wise. And he goes off singing Nasruddin's praises, which only serves to bring more people beating a path to his door, asking for advice. One man comes to him, he says, Nasruddin, he says, my daughter, who I thought was going to be my comfort in my old age, she's turned into a moth. You never see her during daylight hours. She hides away, and at night time she flutters around and flickers around, and she paints her face white, and she wears black lipstick and black clothing, and I think you'll find, said Nasruddin, your daughter hasn't turned into a moth. She's turned into a goth. There you are, you see, says the man. You are much wiser than I. Nasruddin thinks to himself, this man's a fool. I know nothing of children. I have no children. What am I supposed to tell him? But out loud he says to the man, take your troubles to the Lord in prayer, and he will tell you what to do. Oh, Nasruddin, you have saved my life and my family, says the man. You truly are the wisest man in all creation. And off he goes, singing Nasruddin's praises, bringing even more people beating a path to his door. And this goes on for days and weeks and months. He hasn't slept a wink. He can hardly stop to get something to eat. Nasruddin, Nasruddin. So finally, he hits on a plan. And he puts up a sign outside the door. It says, all your problems solved. Ask me any 2 questions. 100 dinar. Well, it works like a charm. The crowds of people beating a path to his door, as soon as they see the sign, soon as they see they have to pay to ask him any questions, they disappear. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Nasruddin enjoys a peaceful, quiet night's sleep. And so things go on for a few days, and they might have continued to this very day, were it not for the fact that a very, very, very wealthy merchant got to hear of Nasruddin's fame, got to hear of his wisdom, and he came a-visiting. Now this man was wealthy beyond belief, but he had a problem that not even his wealth could solve. He came to Nasruddin's door, knocked, and when Nasruddin came out, he said, aha, I hear you can solve any problem, and according to the sign on here, you can. So you know how much this is going to cost you, said Nasruddin. Oh, no problem, said the man, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a billfold, peeled off several bills and handed them over. But as he was counting them out, he thought to himself, and he spoke the thought out loud, and he said to Nasruddin, don't you think 100 dinar is a lot of money for, just 2 questions? I suppose it is, said Nasruddin, counting the money and putting it in his pocket. And he turned to the merchant and said, okay, that was your first question. Now, what's your second question? Right, said the merchant. Here's my problem. Flowers, he said. I love roses. I don't know why. Ever since I was a little boy, I've just always loved roses. There's something about them that just entranced me. I just love them. So what I've done is I've bought acres, hectares of land. And on this land, I plant roses. And every year come harvest time, what do you think I get? Dandelions. I plant roses, I get dandelions. I can't understand it. I've tried everything. Well, said Nasruddin, that is indeed a conundrum. Right. Well, I've heard of a cure, he said, which is meant to work. You need to buy yourself 10,000 tons of the richest, stinkiest, gooeyest, most disgusting elephant dung that you can think of. And then you need to get yourself 10,000 tons of the hottest, fiercest chili peppers. You know that Scotch bonnet pepper? And you grind the chili peppers and you mix it with the... Oh, the old chili and elephant dung cure, said the man. I've tried that. It didn't work. Oh dear, said Nasruddin. We do have a problem, don't we? Well, here's the other solution you could try. You could relocate to the banks of the River Nile, because there the land is so fertile that anything you plant will grow. So you sell all your lands, you sell all your holdings, you transfer everything to... A little bit of an expensive, not to say impractical solution, said the merchant, even for one as wealthy as I. Dear, 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 said Nasruddin. In this case, we do have a problem, don't we? Well, I do have a solution to your problem, and it's guaranteed to work. Tell me, said the merchant. I'm not sure you're going to like it, said Nasruddin. Oh, if it's guaranteed to work, said the merchant, I'm definitely going to do it, whatever it is. Are you sure, says Nasruddin. Absolutely, said the merchant. Tell me. I'll do it. I'll follow whatever instruction you give. Tell me. I'll do it. Tell me. Right, said Nasruddin. So your problem is you love roses. Yes, said the merchant. You buy land, you plant roses, said Nasruddin. Yes, said the merchant. But instead of roses, every year you get dandelions, said Nasruddin. That's right, said the man. Well, said Nasruddin, here is the solution to your problem. You must learn to love dandelions. And that's it.